The message that changed everything arrived before sunrise. I was standing on a bridge project in Vancouver, Canada, reviewing the overnight progress reports while the rest of the city was still quiet. My coffee had already gone cold when my phone vibrated with an email from my mother. I almost ignored it. Instead, I opened it. The email was only a few lines long. She wrote that she and my father had sold Harborview Cottage, the home my husband Ethan and I had built together on the piece of land my grandmother had left to me. The money, she explained, had gone to pay off my younger sister Megan's gambling debt. Then I reached the last sentence. You already have a successful life. We thought you'd understand. I didn't move. I didn't blink. For a few seconds, the construction site disappeared around me. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent most of my career designing bridges. I've always believed every structure depends on trust. If the foundation fails, everything above it eventually follows. I never imagined my own family would prove that lesson first. I read my mother's email again. Then a third time. I kept expecting the words to change, as if I'd misunderstood something. They didn't. There wasn't an apology. There wasn't even a question. It wasn't, can we talk? It wasn't. We had no choice. It was simply a statement. They had sold my home. I pressed Ethan's name before I could think myself into panic. He answered on the second ring. Morning, he said, his voice still rough from sleep. Everything okay? No. The single word was enough. He sat up immediately. What happened? I just sent you the email. A few quiet seconds passed while he opened it. Then I heard him exhale. They sold the cottage? So they say. Without asking you? Apparently. His voice became steady. I'm going there. You don't have to. I'm already getting dressed. I closed my eyes for a moment. I'll catch the first flight home. No, he said gently. Stay where you are until I know what's happening. Let me see it with my own eyes. That was Ethan. While I was still trying to process impossible news, he was already making a plan. I'll call you from the driveway. Okay. Neither of us said goodbye. The line simply disconnected. I looked back toward the bridge. Workers were guiding steel beams into place. Cranes swung through the pale morning sky. Everyone around me kept doing their jobs. The world hadn't noticed, mine had just tilted sideways. A project manager walked over, holding a clipboard. You ready for the inspection meeting? I forced myself to nod. Give me 5 minutes. He smiled, completely unaware. No rush. If only he knew. For the next half hour, I answered questions about load calculations, expansion joints, and safety reports. Somehow, my mouth kept speaking, while my mind stayed thousands of miles away. Every few minutes, I checked my phone. Nothing. Then finally, it rang. Ethan? I'm here. I immediately heard engines in the background, heavy ones, diesel trucks. What do you see? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. There are 2 moving trucks. My grip tightened around the phone. What? They're loading furniture. I stopped breathing. Our furniture? Everything. I heard footsteps crunch across the driveway. There's a locksmith here too. My stomach dropped. They're changing every lock on the house. What? I asked one of the movers who hired them. And? He pointed toward your parents. Silence filled the call. Then Ethan spoke again. They're standing on the porch. My parents? Yes. What are they doing? Watching. Another voice echoed faintly through the phone. Someone laughed. Someone signed paperwork. It sounded organized, planned, official, as if none of it belonged to me anymore. Ethan's voice became firm. I'm going to stop them. Before I could answer, I heard him call out, Excuse me, everyone needs to stop working for a minute. The sounds of boxes being moved slowed. Then my mother's familiar voice carried clearly through Ethan's phone. Keep loading the truck, she said. The property belongs to our family. I need everyone to stay exactly where they are." Ethan's voice stayed calm. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening anyone. That almost made the silence afterward feel heavier. One of the movers looked toward my parents. "We're just following the paperwork, sir." "I understand," Ethan replied, "but this ownership is being disputed." My mother crossed her arms. "There is no dispute." I could hear her clearly through the phone. "Keep working." Ethan ignored her and stepped farther into the driveway. "I've already called the police." That was the first time I heard hesitation from the workers. A few stopped carrying boxes. Others exchanged nervous looks. Nobody wanted to be caught in the middle of a family fight. I muted my microphone because someone from my engineering team was asking me another question. For the next few minutes, I explained bridge inspections while watching my own life fall apart through a phone screen. It felt unreal. When the meeting finally ended, I walked outside the temporary site office and called my bank, then my attorney, then the local police department handling the property. I repeated the same sentence so many times, it almost stopped sounding real. "I believe my family has transferred or sold property without my authorization." My attorney didn't sound surprised. Instead, he asked one question. "Evelyn, do you remember what happened 4 years ago?" Of course I did. I'd spent years trying not to think about it. Back then, my father had used my personal information to help Megan qualify for vehicle financing after she'd destroyed her credit. He promised it was temporary. He promised he'd tell me everything. He never did. I only found out when a collection notice arrived at my office. That was the day something changed inside me. I didn't cut my parents out of my life, but I stopped assuming they respected boundaries. Quietly, without making a family announcement, I started protecting myself. Harborview Cottage was transferred into Blue Tide Property, LLC, a company my attorney helped me establish. Every legal notice went to a different mailing address. Every property document was stored digitally and in a secure physical file. Every strange conversation, every unusual request for signatures, every financial incident involving Megan, I wrote them down with dates. Ethan used to joke that I documented everything like an engineer. Maybe I did, but engineers survive by preparing for failure before it happens. Around noon, my phone rang again. It was Detective Rachel Morgan. She introduced herself, then spoke with the steady tone of someone who preferred facts over opinions. "We've started reviewing the paperwork presented during the property transfer. Did you find anything? There is a power of attorney included in the file." My heart skipped. I never signed one. That's why I'm calling. A few minutes later, she emailed me a scanned copy. I opened it immediately. At first glance, it looked convincing. My name, my information, even a signature that looked almost identical to mine. Almost. I zoomed in. Then I felt something inside me go completely still. "I know this signature," I whispered. Detective Morgan waited. "My father copied it." "You're certain?" "Years ago, he used to practice my signature when we were signing permit applications together. He laughed about how similar our handwriting looked." The detective didn't interrupt. "He isn't guessing," I continued quietly. "He's repeating something he already learned." There was a long pause. "I'm adding that statement to the report," Detective Morgan said. When the call ended, I stared at the scanned document for several minutes. I wasn't wondering anymore. I wasn't trying to convince myself there had been some misunderstanding. This wasn't one bad decision. This was a pattern. Every time Megan created another financial disaster, someone expected me to absorb the damage. Every time my parents crossed a line, they acted as though family automatically erased consequences. My father hadn't just lost my trust. I realized I couldn't remember the last time he'd actually earned it. If you've ever seen family loyalty pushed past its limits, let me know in the comments. Sometimes the hardest conflicts aren't with strangers. They're with the people who believe they'll always be forgiven. Just before ending our call, Detective Morgan cleared her throat. "Mrs. Carter." "Yes?" "There's one legal detail I don't think anyone involved has realized yet." Then she stopped talking, as if she wanted to choose her next words very carefully. I don't think anyone involved realizes the property wasn't legally owned by the people who tried to sell it. Detective Morgan let that sentence settle before she continued. The house has been owned by Blue Tide Property LLC for years. I closed my eyes. So, the sale has no legal effect if the documents were signed without authority, she finished. From everything we've reviewed so far, this transaction should never have happened. For the first time since opening my mother's email, I took a full breath. The damage was real. But legally, the house was still mine. That didn't bring back what had already disappeared. My flight home felt endless. Every time I tried to sleep, I kept seeing movers carrying boxes through the front door. I landed in Massachusetts, exhausted, and Ethan was already waiting outside the airport. The second I saw him, I wrapped my arms around him. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "No." He nodded. "I know." The drive to Harbor View Cottage was mostly silent, not uncomfortable, just quiet enough for both of us to think. When the cottage finally came into view, my chest tightened. The porch looked the same. The white fence was still standing. The old maple tree still shaded the front yard. But the house didn't feel like home anymore. Inside, every room echoed. The walls looked strangely bare. The bookshelves I'd built with my grandfather were empty. The dining room where our family celebrated birthdays felt abandoned. I walked into the living room and stopped. The corner beside the fireplace was empty. I stared at it for a long moment. "The clock," I whispered. Ethan looked down. "I'm sorry." My grandmother's grandfather clock had stood there for as long as I could remember. She used to wind it every Sunday afternoon while telling me stories about our family. It wasn't expensive. It was priceless. "They sold it," I said. He nodded once. "I couldn't get there before they loaded it." I sat down on the floor because my legs suddenly didn't want to hold me anymore. Ethan knelt beside me. I managed to save a few things. He handed me a printed inventory, family photo albums, our marriage certificate, my grandmother's handwritten recipe box, several legal binders, a few framed pictures. Not much, but enough to remind me someone had fought for this house while I was thousands of miles away. "I didn't know what mattered most, Meryl," he admitted, so I grabbed everything I recognized. I smiled for the first time in days. "You chose exactly what mattered." He reached over and squeezed my hand. "We'll replace furniture." I nodded. "We can't replace memories." "No," he said softly, "but we can protect the ones they didn't take." That afternoon, we met Detective Morgan in person. She spread several folders across the conference table. "The fraudulent paperwork is becoming clearer," she explained. She pointed toward the property records. "Blue Tide Property LLC has been the legal owner for years, so they never had authority to sell it." "Correct." "And the buyer?" "The buyer believed the transaction was legitimate." I rubbed my forehead. "So everyone was deceived." "That's what the evidence suggests." Before leaving the station, my phone buzzed. "Mom." I stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. Then another message appeared. "Can we please talk like a family? Come over tonight." A minute later, another one arrived. "You're making this much bigger than it needs to be." Then another. "Your father isn't sleeping. Megan is terrified." I showed Ethan. He read every message without saying anything. Finally, he looked at me. "You don't owe anyone a meeting." "I know, but if you decide to go, you're not going alone." That evening, we sat across from my parents in the same dining room where we'd once celebrated Christmas together. Mom cried almost immediately. Dad barely looked at me. Megan stayed silent. "We made one mistake," my mother said. "You're treating us like criminals." I looked at her calmly. "You sold my home. We were trying to save your sister. You forged documents." Dad finally spoke. "We're your parents." I waited, as if that explained everything. Mom reached across the table. "Families forgive each other." I stood before she could touch my hand. "Families don't steal from each other." Nobody followed us as Ethan and I walked out. The next morning, I pushed open the doors of the police station. Detective Morgan placed the completed report in front of me, turned it toward me, and quietly slid over a pen. I signed my name without my hand shaking. Detective Morgan collected the report, closed the file, and looked at me for a moment. "From this point forward," she said, "this is no longer just a family disagreement." I nodded. "I understand. No matter what anyone tells you, let the evidence do the talking." That became my goal. Not revenge, not winning, just the truth. Over the next few days, everything that had looked so organized started falling apart. The title company froze the entire transaction after reviewing the ownership records from Blue Tide Property, LLC. No money could move, no deed could be recorded, no legal transfer could continue. The fake paperwork had reached the end of the road. Then another phone call came. This time, it wasn't Detective Morgan. It was the real estate agent. "My name is Elaine Brooks," she said carefully. "I handled the listing for Harbor View Cottage." I had never spoken to her before. "I think I owe you an apology." "You didn't know?" "No." Her voice sounded exhausted. "I believed every document I received was legitimate." She paused before continuing. "When I learned the signatures may have been forged, I reported everything to the authorities myself." I appreciated that she called me directly instead of hiding behind lawyers. "I'm sorry this happened to you," she said. "So am I." Neither of us blamed the other. We had both been deceived. By the end of the week, the buyer's attorney demanded the return of the $64,800 deposit that had already been paid. The money wasn't with me. It had never been. That demand shifted the pressure back where it belonged. The people responsible suddenly had very expensive questions to answer. The investigation grew faster than I expected. Forgery, identity fraud, attempted fraudulent property transfer. What had started as relatives making a bad decision was becoming a criminal investigation. News travels quickly in families, especially when nobody has the full story. My phone barely stopped vibrating. An aunt left a voicemail. "Evelyn, they're your parents. Surely this can be handled privately." A cousin sent a text. "You've embarrassed the whole family." Someone else wrote, "Your mother can't stop crying." Not one person asked how I was doing. Not one person asked whether the documents had actually been forged. Most of them had already chosen a side. I stopped trying to defend myself. Instead, I forwarded every message to my attorney and saved screenshots in the same folder where I'd been documenting everything else. Ethan noticed I had gone unusually quiet during dinner one evening. He set down his fork. "You don't have to read every message." "I know. So why do it?" I looked at my phone. "I keep hoping one of them will ask what really happened." "And have they?" I gave a small smile. "No." He reached across the table and turned my phone face down. "Then eat." It was such a small gesture. But in that moment, it reminded me that not everyone expected something from me. Some people simply wanted to take care of me. If you've ever had to choose facts over family pressure, I'd love to hear how you handled it. And if you're following my story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what happened next. That weekend, another letter arrived from my parents' attorney. It suggested mediation. It emphasized reconciliation. It never mentioned forged signatures. It never mentioned my missing belongings. It simply encouraged everyone to move forward peacefully. I folded the letter, placed it in my evidence file, and said nothing. Silence was becoming stronger than arguments. Late that evening, just as Ethan and I were getting ready to turn off the lights, my phone rang again. The screen showed a name I hadn't expected to see. Megan. For a second, I thought about letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered. I didn't even have time to say hello. All I heard was my younger sister crying so hard she could barely breathe. I didn't know they were going to do that. Megan's voice was barely above a whisper. She was still crying. For years, I had heard my sister apologize for things. Apologize after losing money. Apologize after asking for help. Apologize after creating another problem everyone else had to fix. But this sounded different. This time, she sounded scared. Did you know Mom and Dad were selling the cottage? I asked. No. The answer came quickly. I swear, Evelyn, I knew they were trying to find money, but I didn't know they were going to use your house. I sat at the edge of the bed while Ethan watched from across the room. Then why did they do it? Megan didn't answer immediately. I told them I was going to stop. Stop what? She cried again. Gambling. I closed my eyes. The words still hurt, not because I was surprised, because I had hoped this time would be different. How much? I asked. I don't know. Megan? I don't know exactly. Her voice cracked. But it's bad. I looked at Ethan. He didn't say anything. He just listened. I can help you, I told her. A pause. You can? Yes. She started crying harder. But there are conditions. The crying stopped. What kind? I will pay directly for treatment. Silence. A rehabilitation program. A real one. Evelyn? No cash. No money sent to you. No money sent to Mom or Dad. She didn't respond. And I am not withdrawing the report. The silence afterward was longer. I knew you would say that. I need you to understand something, Megan. Helping you doesn't mean pretending this never happened. I know. Her voice was smaller now. I really messed up. That was the first honest thing she had said to me in years. Not an excuse, not a reason, just the truth. I don't hate you, I said. She started crying again. But I can't keep saving you from consequences. After the call ended, I stayed quiet for a while. Ethan sat beside me. How do you feel? I thought about it. I don't know. That was the honest answer. I felt angry. I felt sad. I felt sorry for her, all at the same time. I want her to get better, I said. I know. But I don't know if I can trust her. Ethan nodded. You don't have to decide everything today. That was something I was learning. Not every problem needed an immediate solution. Some things needed boundaries first. A few days later, my father asked to meet me alone. I almost refused. But something in me wanted answers. Not excuses, answers. We sat at a small coffee shop near his house. For the first 10 minutes, he barely touched his drink. Then he finally spoke. Your mother didn't grow up like you did. I stayed quiet. Her family had almost nothing. There were times they didn't know if they'd have enough food. I listened. Not because it erased what happened, because I wanted to understand how someone could convince themselves this was acceptable. Your mother learned one thing very early, Dad continued. Family takes care of family. I looked at him. Even when someone gets hurt? He looked away. I know what you're going to say. No, Dad, I don't think you do. He sighed. We made mistakes. More than mistakes. His face changed slightly. You think your mother is a bad person? I looked down at the table. No. The answer surprised even me. That's the problem. He waited. I think she is someone who was hurt and never learned how to stop hurting other people. My father didn't respond. And I think she used that pain to justify things she knew were wrong. For once, he didn't defend her. Maybe because he knew I was right. I walked away from that conversation with something I hadn't expected, understanding. But understanding didn't mean forgiveness. It didn't mean trust. It didn't mean I had to pretend the damage wasn't real. Sometimes people have painful histories. Sometimes they become victims of circumstances. But sometimes victims can also become the person causing harm. And both things can be true. The legal process continued moving forward. My attorney kept me updated. Detective Morgan kept gathering evidence. And eventually, I met with the prosecutor assigned to the case. She reviewed the documents carefully before looking at me. Evelyn, I want you to understand something. What? When this reaches court, your statement will matter. I sat quietly. How much? She folded her hands. A lot. I looked at the file in front of her. The house, the documents, the signatures, the years of trust that had disappeared. The judge will consider many things, she explained. But your experience as the victim and your response to what happened will be important. I swallowed. Because for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about getting my home back. My words were about to become part of what happened next. The first version of my statement was almost impossible to read. I typed it late at night at the kitchen table while Ethan was asleep. Every sentence came from anger. I wrote about the email. I wrote about the movers. I wrote about seeing my grandmother's clock disappear from the place where it had stood for years. I wrote about every time my parents had asked me to understand, while never trying to understand me. Then I stopped. I looked at the screen. The words were honest, but they didn't sound like me. They sounded like someone trying to make another person feel the same pain they caused. I deleted half of it. The second version was completely different. Too different. I wrote about my mother's childhood, about my father's regrets, about Megan's addiction. I wrote about how I knew they were broken people. I wrote about how I didn't want them destroyed. When I finished, I read it again. This time, it felt like I was apologizing for being hurt. I closed my laptop. 2 versions. Neither one felt right. Ethan noticed the next morning. "You didn't sleep much." I shook my head. "I can't figure out what to write." He poured coffee and sat across from me. "Because you don't know what you want?" "No. I know what happened. I know what they did. But I don't want to become someone who only thinks about punishment." Ethan nodded. "That's a hard line to walk." "I feel angry." "You should. But I also feel sorry for them." He didn't argue. Both can exist. I keep thinking about my mom, about everything she went through. And I understand why she became the way she is. Ethan waited. "But understanding her doesn't mean I have to accept what she did." "Exactly." The room became quiet. Then he said, "Write something you'll still believe when you're 60. I looked at him. "What?" "Not something you'll believe today because you're hurt." He leaned back. "Not something you'll regret because you were trying to be kind. Something you'll still stand by years from now." That sentence stayed with me. I had been writing from pain. But this statement wasn't about the worst day of my life. It was about what I needed going forward. So I started again. This time, I didn't write about revenge. I wrote about consequences, trust, accountability. I wrote that my parents' struggles deserved compassion, but compassion could not erase responsibility. I wrote about Megan, about hoping she would finally choose recovery. And I wrote about myself, not as a daughter who failed to forgive, but as someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities that were never mine. When I finished, I didn't feel angry. I just felt certain. I sent the final draft to my attorney. A few days later, she called. "Evelyn, this is strong." I waited. "But it's emotional without attacking anyone. It explains the damage without exaggerating." That's what I wanted. There was a pause. "You understand that court may still be difficult." "I know. And seeing your family there won't be easy." "I know." The days before the hearing were strange. Life kept moving. I reviewed engineering plans, answered emails, had lunch with coworkers who respected my privacy. One finally asked, "Are you okay?" I almost said, "I'm fine." Instead, I answered, "I will be." At home, Ethan tried to keep things normal. We cooked dinner, watched old movies, talked about anything except court. It reminded me I was still more than this case. The night before the hearing, I found him checking the documents again. "You know I trust you, right?" "I know. You don't have to keep checking." He smiled. "Maybe I do." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. Then he closed the folder. "Tomorrow isn't about proving you're right." I nodded. "It's about telling the truth." That was enough. The courthouse doors opened. People filled the hallway. My attorney walked beside me. Ethan squeezed my hand before we entered. Then the clerk called our case. I stood when the judge called my name. The courtroom was quiet enough that I could hear the papers turning. My parents sat a few rows away. My mother looked exhausted. My father stared at the table in front of him. Megan couldn't stop twisting her hands together. The prosecutor presented the evidence one piece at a time. The forged power of attorney. The ownership records showing Harborview Cottage belonged to Blue Tide Property, LLC. The false signatures. The testimony from the title company. The statement from real estate agent Elaine Brooks explaining how she had unknowingly relied on fraudulent documents. Nothing sounded dramatic, just facts, one after another. That was enough. When it was my turn, I walked to the front with my victim impact statement. I didn't rush. I read exactly what I had written. I spoke about trust, about spending years cleaning up problems that weren't mine, about loving my family while refusing to excuse what they had done. When I finished, the judge thanked me. Then came the question everyone seemed to be waiting for. What outcome are you asking this court to consider? For a moment, nobody moved. I knew what many people expected. Some wanted me to demand prison. Others expected me to beg for mercy. I did neither. I'm asking for full restitution, I said. I want every financial loss to be repaid. I took a breath. I want strict probation with meaningful oversight. The judge nodded for me to continue. I also asked that the court prohibit the use of anyone else's identity or financial information without verified authorization. I looked toward Megan, and I asked that my sister be required to complete a gambling rehabilitation program. The courtroom stayed silent. I don't want another family to go through this. That was all I had to say. The hearing continued for another hour. Lawyers spoke, documents were reviewed, questions were answered. When it finally ended, people slowly began leaving the courtroom. Ethan met me in the hallway. "You did well," he said. I told the truth. "You did." For the first time in months, I felt lighter. Not because everything had been fixed, because I had finally stopped carrying responsibility for choices that were never mine. That feeling didn't last long. My mother walked toward me before we reached the exit. Her eyes were red. "This is your fault," she said quietly. I looked at her. If you had dropped the charges, none of this would have happened. I didn't answer immediately. She kept going. "Now we'll have to sell our own house." There it was. Another attempt to place the weight on my shoulders. For years, I would have accepted it, not anymore. I met her eyes. "No, Mom." She froze. "You lost your house because of your own decisions." She opened her mouth. I continued before she could interrupt. "I didn't forge documents. I didn't sell property that wasn't mine. I didn't lie." Her face fell. For the first time, I wasn't speaking out of anger. I was speaking without guilt. Ethan gently touched my arm. "We should go." I nodded. As we walked away, I didn't hear my mother call my name. She knew I wasn't coming back to that conversation. If you've ever had to set a boundary with someone you loved, you know how painful it can be. But sometimes, it's the only way to stop the same cycle from repeating. We were almost at the courthouse doors when I heard footsteps behind us. "Evelyn." I turned. Megan stood there, breathing hard as if she'd run the length of the hallway. She looked different. Not because everything was suddenly better, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't asking for money. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. Then she asked, almost in a whisper, "Is it too late to accept your offer?" I looked at Megan for a long moment. "No," I said, "it's not too late." She covered her mouth and started crying again. "But the offer hasn't changed." She nodded before I could finish. "I know. No cash. I know. You have to finish the program." "I will. And I'm not changing my statement." She wiped her eyes. "I'm not asking you to." That was the first conversation we'd had in years that didn't end with either of us trying to rescue the other. Just honesty. A few weeks later, the judge issued the final decision. Most of my requests were granted. Full restitution, strict probation, restrictions preventing my parents from using another person's identity or financial information without proper authorization. Megan was ordered into a rehabilitation program as part of her sentence. The courtroom was quiet when everything was over. No one celebrated, no one won. There were only consequences. The hardest one came later. My parents' house had to be sold to help satisfy the restitution order. When I heard the news, I didn't feel satisfaction. I just sat quietly, on the porch of Harbor View Cottage. Ethan joined me with 2 cups of coffee. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so." "You don't sound convinced." I watched the water for a while. I never wanted them to lose their home. I know. I just wanted them to stop taking mine. He reached over and squeezed my hand. I know that too. Life slowly became ordinary again. Not all at once, just little pieces at a time. I went back to bridge projects. Ethan went back to arguing with me about whose turn it was to cook dinner. The house slowly felt lived in again. Some rooms stayed empty longer than others. We never replaced everything that had been taken. Some things simply couldn't be replaced. About 6 months later, Ethan came home with a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. "I think you should come outside." "What did you do?" "Just trust me." A small truck was parked in the driveway. 2 movers carefully lowered something wrapped in thick blankets. When they pulled the covers away, I couldn't speak. My grandmother's grandfather clock. The same scratches near the base. The tiny crack in the wood she'd always joked gave it character. I covered my face with both hands. "How?" Ethan smiled. "It turned up in an estate auction." "You found it?" "It took a while." I hugged him before he could say anything else. We carried the clock back into the living room together. It stood once again beside the fireplace, exactly where it had always belonged. A few days later, I opened one of the storage boxes Ethan had saved. Inside was the very first blueprint I had drawn for Harbor View Cottage. The paper had yellowed around the edges. I spread it across the dining table. Back then, I thought the strongest foundation was concrete and steel. Now I knew better. A strong home also needs healthy boundaries. Without them, even the strongest walls can't protect the people inside. My relationship with my parents never returned to what it had been. We spoke occasionally. Birthdays, a few holidays, short phone calls. The distance remained, and so did the boundaries. For the first time, neither of us pretended otherwise. Megan finished rehabilitation. Recovery wasn't perfect. Some days were harder than others, but she kept showing up. She found a steady job, started paying back small debts on her own. Every once in a while, she'd call just to tell me she had made it through another month. Not to ask for money, just to share the victory. Those became my favorite calls. Every summer, Ethan and I began opening Harbor View Cottage for a few weeks to families going through difficult seasons. Some were caring for loved ones in recovery. Some were rebuilding after losing everything. Some simply needed a quiet place to breathe. We never asked for anything in return. One evening, as the grandfather clock quietly marked another hour, I looked around the house and realized it finally felt like home again. Not because every scar had disappeared, but because I no longer believed it was my job to save everyone. I'd love to know what you think. If someone you loved crossed a line this serious, could you forgive them while still keeping firm boundaries? Share your thoughts and where you're watching from. I read more of your comments than you might expect.